In Jesus' name we pray, amen. All right. Now, let me move forward here. His life is remarkable and certainly one to be uplifted and reminded. And we were right here dealing with Sierra Leone. Now, he's involved with the creation of this colony too. It will become a British possession in 1808. And I mentioned that this company, the Sierra Leone Company, was founded by Clapham sect people to be a private organization that would promote this area. At first, just a small area right about here, and then eventually what is the whole area of Sierra Leone, where the freed slaves would be able to go. Because there was no slavery in Britain. There was slavery, let's say, in Jamaica, or slavery in the Bahamas or places like that, but there was no slavery in Britain. So those Africans might be brought here to Sierra Leone. Now, what are some of the limitations of this particular place? The pressing demands of life in the settlement meant that it was not a comfortable existence for the freed slaves that went there to live. So there was a significant number of people that might escape to other place or leave or die. As we saw from before, of the 400 initial settlers that were taken from London to Sierra Leone, only 48 were still living less than 4 years later there. Now, maybe not all of them had died, but some decided they'd rather not be there. The nearest neighbors to Freetown were partly Islamicized, or that there was lots of Muslims in this area. Some were middlemen in the local slave factories. So if you're looking at the map here of Sierra Leone and Freetown, which will be where they will live, that it complicates things if the closest people to your area of living are Muslims who might be actually participating in the slave trade at some level. Black Nova Scotians ran the risk, the black Nova Scotians that were brought there, who were freed slaves from the American Revolution, the American South, that were taken to Nova Scotia and then brought there. There was always the possibility that if they went strayed too far away from home, that they might be captured and sold into slavery again by the Muslim slave traders that lived close by. So it wasn't exactly a safe haven. And the British were ineffective. Two Baptist Missionary Society missionaries came in 1795 to support the Nova Scotian Baptists. A group of ill-prepared Methodists arrived to support the Nova Scotian Methodists. So there were some British missionaries that did arrive there, and there were 4 missionaries from the Church Missionary Society, but unfortunately, these individuals were often not the highest quality, and were not very capable. Also, there was also the issue of some degree of racial disparity as well. The organization that is of importance here is the Church Missionary Society. The Church Missionary Society was founded in London by Anglican clergy in 1799, and members of the Clapham sect, including William Wilberforce, were involved in this. So here is their seal, the Church Missionary Society: preach the gospel to every creature. That's a good plan. Charles Grant, a member of the Clapham sect, was very influential in this. He had served in India with the Baptist the British East India Company. After his conversion, he expressed concern that little evangelization was being done by British East India chaplains. And primarily they were just there to minister to the British, not to the Indians. In 1790, he returned to England and was elected to Parliament from the village of Clapham. There was also a need for Evangelical Anglican Missionary Society to contemplate existing missions. The Baptist Missionary Society and the London Missionary Society were both dissenting groups, not part of the Anglican Church. And so in order to get the Anglican Church and the government really behind Sierra Leone and what was going on there, you needed to have a missionary organization that was connected more completely to the established church. The Anglican SPCK, Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. These are two different groups. One of them, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, was the Anglican Missionary Society that actually sent John Wesley to Savannah. The SPCA was sort of like a publishing outreach that was designed, that still exists today. You can still go to London and go to SPCK bookstores, and they still publish things for the Anglican Church that we would think of as devotional materials and things of that type. It's one of their publishing houses, but is more involved with Bible study aids and devotional things and things of that type. Anyway, they focused on the British settlers and not native Indians. So it was thought that there was a need to have another organization that was connected to the Anglican Church that would be focused on ministering to the native populations, Africans or Indians or such, not British people that happened to be outside of England. Because let's face it, that's what John Wesley did. You know, he was a chaplain to the Georgia colonists. And if any Indians wanted to hear about the gospel, they needed to come to him. He didn't go to the Indians, which meant he didn't see very many of them. In April 12, 1799, 16 evangelical Anglican ministers and 9 lay individuals formed a society to employ Episcopal ordained missionaries and send them to Africa. Since India was unavailable because of the opposition of the, well, really they were going to send them anywhere, but the British East India Company opposed missionary work among the Indian population, so they decided that Sierra Leone would be the place where they would go minister. It had already been set up as a colony, a British colony for freed African slaves, so that would be a good place to send the Anglican ministers who would minister to them. Now, this did not start very well. Let's face, to begin with small beginnings, and hopefully everything will work out better later. At least they didn't give up, because the starting of this was kind of disappointing, to say the least. A dearth of British candidates willing to serve as missionaries with the Church Missionary Society in Africa was their first problem to overcome. The society needed to rely primarily on pietistic German Lutherans to go serve in this Anglican missionary organization. So they were from a different theological strain, and they were not even British. So most of the missionaries that they sent initially were German Lutherans, even though this was a British Anglican mission. That's a bad sign. 16 missionaries were sent to Sierra Leone in 1815. 13 were Germans trained in either Basel, or Berlin. So that means only 3. You can get some math credit here. Only 3 were British. There was a high mortality rate among their missionaries in Africa. There was a lot of death among the Church Missionary Society. In the first 20 years, they sent 50 missionaries to Africa who died. Now, they probably sent some that survived, hopefully. But let me tell you, if you're going to send 50 missionaries who die in 20 years, that's a significant number. I mean, let's say that there were 50 members of the staff that came here in the last 20 years who died. That's a lot of death among the staff, among missionaries. You're going to notice that significantly, mostly because of tropical diseases that they were unaccustomed to. And if you come from Great Britain and you go to Africa, even the Africans might not be dying because they are accustomed to the disease, but the white visitors who are going to stay there now, they were likely to get sick, and then they couldn't fight off the disease and they died. So that's not uncommon. That's true of lots of places. This is not just true of Africa, but it's a big problem. And some early missionaries were not exceptional. Many of these missionaries were not the highest quality. Peter Hartwig and Melchior Rainier, who were the first 2 missionaries, arrived in April of 1804. Hartwig was said to be idle and quarrelsome. He eventually became a public nuisance and was dismissed from service in 1807 and stayed on, employed as a slave trader, one of those people you had to watch out for who might capture the released slaves there in Sierra Leone and send them back into slavery. That's only one example. So some of them clearly were not the best quality. The changing relationship between the Church Missionary Society and Sierra Leone, the Sierra Leone Company. The company was formed to spread the Christian message into the interior of Africa. So let's go back to our map. We're talking about in here, but for the most part, they only occupy the coastline. So that's a big problem. So here we are. Also, a missionary was provided to act as a company chaplain for its English personnel. And if the missionary is serving as a chaplain for the English personnel, but they're also saying that they want to go into the interior, you've got a conflict of interest that's naturally going to develop as a result of that. Melchior Rainier, one of the other early missionaries, accepted this position because he believed that it was not time to convert the targeted ethnic group. And so instead of really working towards ministering in the interior with the native population, he decided it would be better off for him to take a position with the company and serve as a chaplain to the British personnel that were coming over to help run the colony, because until we established that real well, it was pointless to try and go and minister to the native population. It also, I would imagine, is easier. Certainly would be more difficult and more take more effort to go out into to be a pioneer missionary into the interior of the jungle than to stay near the coastline and be more of a chaplain like in England. And eventually the company came to share this view so that they really discouraged the very purpose of the mission. And by 1808, the company was disbanded and it became a crown colony, just like any other colony in England. Now, here's Sierra Leone. I added this little drawing. I'm getting more adept at doing these PowerPoint. To the map to tell us where I'm talking about, but just north of here, there's a bunch of these different colonies. This is the country of Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia is right here, and then you have Guinea-Bissau and Senegal, a bunch of these little countries here in West Africa. Every country in Europe either wanted a piece of the slave trade or they wanted a place to send people that might be freed from slaves. So there's a bunch of these little countries. So this is the area just north of Sierra Leone that we're referring to here. Now, this is the Rio Pongus mission. Rio Pongus, this river right there that comes into this valley, that's where we're referring to. This was launched by the Church Missionary Society in 1808 among the Susu in an area rife with the slave trade. It's 120 miles north of Freetown. Freetown is right there. No, it doesn't say on this map, but that's where it is. And 120 miles north of there, outside of colonial interference. This piece of land was not really under any European control at this time. So the mission did not have to worry about what the colony's government was telling them. But opposition did exist from local slave traders and Muslims that were operating in that area. Now, by this time, this is after 1807, Britain outlaws the slave trade. And they are not only going to be against the slave trade themselves, and they're shutting that down, but they will now police other nations who are operating in the slave trade. So they will actively try and disrupt the slave trade of other nations. The Susu chief, Fatamai, invited the missionaries to start a mission on the Pongus River. And his son, William, had studied at the African Institute near London that was set up by the Clapham sect. So while this African chief had a son named William, which may be an anglicized name, who was already in London and had attended a Clapham sect religious school. And so there was a degree of friendliness to Christianity and European mission and this mindset. So they had an invitation to come. The hope was that this could be a springboard to much of West Africa. If you could have a friendly chief and an area where there was already some connection to European Christianity, you get locals saved, they could become missionaries to their own people in the interior of Africa. That might be more effective and die less frequently than the British that were coming over. That's important too. I mean, they live here until they're old, and so they're less likely to die if they go into the interior than bringing over Europeans would be. The Susu language was widely spoken even among other ethnic groups. It seemed to have been sort of a mother language in that area. That was helpful. These people could communicate with others as a second language. And Susu converts would be the vanguard, hopefully, of African missionaries that would later serve. So it was founded with 5 mission stations and established churches and schools. Education was given a priority. For the children of headmen, local traders, and freed slaves. But these educational opportunities were provided in English, not in the Susan language. That was because even though these they didn't want them to forget their native tongue, but the missionaries might not necessarily be required then to learn the African language before they could be missionaries. So the schooling was still in English, but they were hoping that this would be good. And you would then open yourself up to having the elites of the society send their kids to these schools, and then they would be educated in Western Christianity and would hopefully become Christians themselves. This mission also did not necessarily go as well as you would hope. It eventually ended in 1817. The mission's personnel reported to the governor of Sierra Leone that slave ships were conducting human cargo operations in that area. So these missionaries got themselves embroiled in anti-slavery, abolitionist, British political activity. So they found out that there was slaving going on there. The mission is and we could say, okay, we want to stop this, because they were also anti-slavery. But when they found out about the slaving operations, they contacted the political leadership in Sierra Leone and said, there's slaving going on. And then the British forces sailed up there and attempted to confiscate the ships and cargo to stop this. And in doing so, a skirmish resulted in the death of several of the local population. This then meant that the mission was blamed for the crisis by locals, making conditions worse. And so many of the locals who were happy for the education felt that these missionaries coming in were creating problems by tattling, if you want to call it that, on the slave operations that were happening, that eventually resulted in the death of some of the local population when the British Navy came in and tried to stop it. And if you were not interfering, these people would not have died. Clearly, the slaving was still going on, but maybe they felt that their children or the people who died were never going to be captured as slaves. So you're responsible for this unrest. So in August of so that incident took place in 1816. But in 1817, the mission compound burned down mysteriously. No one knows exactly why. But it was determined later on that it was not worthwhile to replace it, that to rebuild it would be cost more than it was worth. And as a base of operation was moved back to a safer location in Freetown. So as a result, now anyone who wanted to send their children to school from here would have to come down to schools already established here in Freetown. It could be that the compound was burned down not by locals, but by the slave traders and their supporters who found the missionaries to be a thorn in their side. That's very real of a potential reality. And they were powerful people too, and had a lot of support in the area. So it's possible that the missionaries were being persecuted by them. And so since they already had established areas here, and this was becoming more difficult and expensive, they just decided to cancel that and move everything back to Freetown. Now, this is a term that shows up, liberated Africans, every so often. These would be the label given to Africans who are free and live in Africa, but had been slaves before, or were captured as slaves, and then were brought, let's say, to Sierra Leone or Liberia or somewhere else, and were now freed, but they weren't natives of the place where they lived. Now, after the British outlawed the Atlantic slave trade, they patrolled the west coast of Africa. And any ship that they found that was a slave ship, especially now, if it was a British ship, okay, then they had real jurisdiction there. But they would capture Spanish, Portuguese, French, Dutch, whatever country is involved in the slave trade, and they would liberate the human cargo that was there, the slaves. And we can say that's wonderful. But obviously, the slaves, the Africans that were there in the boat, don't have, ID, photo ID. They have no idea who these people are, where they came from. And maybe they could have figured that out to some degree. That takes too much work. So what they would do is they would take these the human cargo, and the ships were taken to Sierra Leone, and there they were released there as free people. Now that certainly is better than leaving them slaves. So I think we can honor that. But this will create, so sometimes these are called liberated Africans. You will also see this phrase, recaptured slaves, because they were recaptured. They were once captured as slaves, now they were captured by the British as slaves and released. So they were recaptured slaves. They were captured twice. Recaptured slaves were freed and settled in Sierra Leone. By 1808, 2,000 were there. Freed African slaves, recaptured slaves were there. By 1840, there were 76,000. And as time goes on, it's going to get higher and higher as a percentage of the population. Now, this will only represent a small part of the Africans that were transported to America, even during this period, because most of them will get through and are continuing to be brought to the Caribbean, to Brazil, to places like that, in large numbers. But it originated from a broad geographic, these slaves originated from a broad geographic swath of West Africa, representing over 120 language groups and diversity of ethnic groups and language groups. And so languages like Creole are invented to try and help all of these different people groups to communicate. There was some French or English thrown in addition to that, in order to help them. And in America, this is also true about American slavery. I mean, you have or any population, but especially where you have people that are coming together that are from so many different ethnic groups. And if you go down to Georgia, along the Gold Coast and other places, there are subcultures of Africans. Gullah is one, real famous one, but that sort of helped provided some sort of cultural network for the African slaves that created a sense of community for them. This is true everywhere. And so the whole concept here would be, this had to be done here within the recaptured slave population in Sierra Leone. So villages were created with diverse ethnic groups that might be considered to be like conglomerate villages. They would just create villages with all the people that were liberated at a certain time from a certain ship. And as you can see, this partially broke down the old ethnic ties and racial barriers that were in Africa, because the Europeans might not have been able to tell the difference, but I can assure you that there were African ethnical differences that they could tell, and there were all kinds of problems among the African tribes. When you got to Liberia, you had to work together, regardless where you came from. So a new common identity grew up around the shared experience of enslavement, recapture, and liberation. And so, especially in Liberia, there is a Creole culture that and language that made both was made both indigenous and Western elements, and this is similar to the kind of things not spelled the same over in Africa. It's spelled with a K, but the same kind of thing as you see in Louisiana and in the Haiti and Caribbean, where you have a similar type of mixing of African and Western cultures together. Now create a whole new thing. In Georgia, there's the Gullah culture, and we were in New Bern, North Carolina, and there was some sort of African festival that they were getting ready for, and somehow we got in the audience. And Joy was hoping to get up on stage and help to do it, but there was this John Canute. Anyone ever heard of that? Do you know anything about that? Anyway, some African American festival. I don't know if Jacory would know anything about it. Maybe it's just from North Carolina, but apparently they have some kind of a festival, and I have no idea when it was. We were there in June, and they were clearly practicing. So I don't know when it's going to be, but it was some kind of festival where John Canute is some kind of a, I couldn't figure out if he was a person or if it was an event or was something, but he's coming. And so they're all dancing and having festivities. Those kinds of things invented even during slave times to help give them a sense of culture. You got to do that or you're not going to survive as a people. And it's good to remember it for today. And if you talk to Joy about it, she would definitely remember, because for a while, for months, all I heard about was trying to get back there for the festival. And it's okay. And I wouldn't mind doing that, and also going and visiting the drugstore where Pepsi was invented, which is in the same town. So it's an interesting place. Now, civilization. I won't get into this today because I'm far enough along, but this is the next big thing, any more than just introducing it. This is the next big controversy in African missions. The first one is dealing with slavery. They want to go to Africa and create societies that enable the Africans to be equal with Europeans, to help make amends for slavery. That really doesn't work out real well, because there's enough powerful forces that will not allow that to happen. But the Clapensec people, William Wilberforce and others, that's really their goal. And that would have been a great thing if that would have actually happened. That would have been astounding and wonderful. The other thing is, how do we create a connection between the three big issues of the day? You want to have Christianity, commerce, and civilization. So you want to bring civilization to Africa, create an infrastructure of government and education, democracy, civics, all the things that you think they will need in order to become liberated, civilized peoples like the Europeans. And there is some truth to that, although you could say that let them have a kingdom and be as they wish to be. But another thing is, you have to create industry, commerce, that will take the place of the loss of the slave trade for the powerful people that now profit from the slave trade. If they're profiting from the slave trade and you're going to say that's immoral, we're going to take that away, then you've got to figure out what is it that you can do in Africa that will be as profitable as that they will want to participate in, because you just can't say, oh, we're going to take that away and then leave you with nothing. There's got to be something to compensate. So how are you going to do that? Now, of course, at that time, they weren't going to send people there on safaris to take pictures of the elephants. So there's all kinds of things that they're going to try and do. This will then lead to exploration of the continent to find resources like rubber or tin or copper or whatever. That is going to be another important step, but this will, once you find these things, are you really going to let the Africans have it? That the temptation is you're going to keep it for yourself, and so that's the big conundrum you're in. The people who initially began the explorations really did want to do this to create some kind of commerce that would free the Africans from the stain of slavery. But then to try and figure out how to send the profits back to Africa, that's another whole issue that they didn't really think through, how they were going to do that. Because where did the slave, now there were Africans who benefited from the slave trade. And there will be Africans that will benefit from rubber plantations. But the majority of the profits from both sides are going to go to Europeans. So that's a situation that they will deal with. And so the first question is going to be, which is more important? Are we trying to Christianize the people? Because we think that if we bring them commerce and civilization, then Christianity is just going to naturally become a part of that. Because clearly in Europe, that's what we have. We have commerce, we have civilization, and we're Christian. So what order did those things arrive? I'm not sure. But what is more important? Do we want to, do we bring civilization before Christianity? Do we need to make these people like us so that they will convert? Remember before there was this fear, you've got to get the Indians in America living in towns and living like Europeans so that they will convert to Christianity, because you can't be a Christian and be an American Indian living the way American Indians live. So you can't expect the Africans to convert to Christianity if they're living like Africans. They got to live like us. Because the reason why we're saved is because we live like us and they don't. That mindset can cloud what you're doing. So sometimes the missionaries were much more involved with bringing civilization to Africa. Now, this guy is going to be really interesting. This guy was the first African that was ordained as an Anglican preacher. And if they would have just let him go in Africa, I think things would have been much better. He's a great guy, tremendous leader. So we'll see what he does later.
Thanks, Dr.